Welcome to The Space Between, a podcast about seeking and finding alignment. I'm your host, Josh Scott, and I'm grateful that you've joined me for another conversation. Welcome, everybody, to this episode of The Space Between. I'm really excited to introduce my guest for this conversation today, the one and only Brian McLaren. And I'm sure for so many people, Brian doesn't need an introduction, but we'll give one just in case. Brian D. McLaren is a Christian thinker, author, and activist, a former pastor with a background in literature. He's the author of more than a dozen books, an Auburn Senior Fellow, and a board chair of Convergence. So, Brian, thank you so much for being with me today for this conversation.
Happy to be with you.
How's the weather there where you are?
Oh, you don't want to know. It's so perfect. It's just so perfect. It's like mid-80s, sunny, just great.
Oh, that was we actually were close to that yesterday. Low 80s, and then today it's in the 40s. So
yeah, I heard that you guys had a warm snap the other day. Yeah, this is a beautiful time of year. Yeah.
Well, that's fantastic. I hope you'll send some of it our way. Brian, I was actually talking to Charlie Dean, a mutual friend of ours,
yes,
for the podcast last week. And one of the things I noticed as I was talking to him, he said something that almost everybody, at least in my age bracket that I know who's doing this work, when we get together and say, how did this journey begin for you? Almost to a person, they say, well, I read a book by Brian McLaren and for Generous Orthodoxy, New Kind of Christian, and those books. So what that makes me think is that you've helped so many people, played such a significant role in our journey, that you must have had quite a journey yourself. So I hope today we can talk about that.
Sure. Well, I'd have to begin by saying that I'm so grateful that my books have been useful to people. I remember when I wrote my first couple of books, I said to my wife, when this gets published, I'm going to lose all my friends. And I did lose a few. But what ended up happening was a lot of people came out of the woodwork and said, wow, you're writing just what I'm thinking. So the fact that many of us were in the same situation that was untenable for us. We couldn't stay where we were brought up. That meant that we had to go on a journey. For some people, that meant leaving faith. For others of us, it meant going on a kind of journey of faith. And that's what happened to me. I grew up fundamentalist, a little sect called Plymouth Brethren. And, what's interesting is later I identified as an evangelical, but what I've come to realize is I think evangelicals are just fundamentalists. The differences between an evangelical and a fundamentalist might be big to an evangelical and to a fundamentalist, but for everybody else, it's really the same. I grew up literal six-day creation, inerrant Bible, all that whole package. And I think I was doomed for a couple of reasons. Doomed in the sense that it wasn't going to work for me. First, because I was a curious kid. I really loved science. I remember in middle school, I'd read every science book in the children's section. So I went to the grown-ups section and I started picking out the biology textbook for the high school biology textbook. And then I was reading the college textbook. So I was just interested in science. And evolution made a whole lot of sense to me. And I just realized that it's so funny, Josh, because one of the things about growing up fundamentalist is it's very hard to tell the difference between your experience of God and your experience of church.
Oh, yeah.
And so I knew that my church would not accept me if I believed in evolution. I don't think I ever even thought about whether God could exist apart from the opinions of my church. Maybe that's typical for kids, but that was sure the case for me. So I remember thinking I'm in trouble. As well, I was musical, and of course now fundamentalists love rock and roll, but then rock and roll was of the devil. And I played in a little dance band, and that meant that I didn't fit in. So I kind of felt I was on my way out from my junior high years. Then I ended up having this very powerful spiritual experience when I was right around the time I turned 15. And that was when the Jesus movement was just beginning, and I found myself kind of swept up into the Jesus movement, which early on I think had a lot of tension with fundamentalism, but fundamentalism sucked it right in, and it just became a wing, sort of the blue jeans wearing wing of fundamentalism. And so that kept me on a journey, and I ended up becoming a pastor, and I think my experience as a pastor also kept me on a journey. So yeah, I've just been sort of, I wanted to slow down. I wanted to set down roots somewhere. Nobody would let me.
Brian, when you talk about evangelicals, I grew up Free Will Baptist. My grandfather was a Free Will Baptist pastor. And then we became Southern Baptist.
Yeah, and that was like a big step into being liberal, wasn't it?
Oh, it really was. I mean, it really was, because, Southern Baptists believed in eternal security.
Yeah.
Free Will Baptist didn't. And Free Will Baptist didn't believe in paying preachers, and at least our little sect of it. And I remember just all of that feeling like, and hearing about the slippery slope.
Yeah.
And then just the idea of, so when I was first starting out, I've been in this almost 20 years now, ministry wise. And one of the things we always used to say is, we're not talking about changing the message. We're talking about changing the method, and we're going to replace organs with rock and roll music. And that was a slippery slope.
Well, the fact was the worst thing about fundamentalism was the message. I mean, the music was pretty bad sometimes, but listen, and the dress code was kind of weird, and a whole lot of other things were bad. Very often the potlucks were good, but outside of that, a lot of problems. But what we didn't realize, Josh, did you grow up in Kentucky?
Yeah, I did.
Yeah.
Eastern Kentucky, West Virginia line.
Yeah. So what we didn't realize is that we were the inheritors of a white supremacist version of Christianity. And we were the inheritors of a colonial version of Christianity. And we didn't know that. And you know what? I think a lot of times our parents didn't know it either.
Yep.
We studiously said that we just follow the Bible, which allowed us to never tell the truth about our own history. And part of what I think sends people on a journey is when they start to realize that there's a history that actually is very, very formative. You can say, oh, we just follow the Bible, but our way of reading the Bible has a very strong history. And in fact, claiming that you just follow the Bible has a history.
Yep. And
that history is so problematic. And in my mind, in today's world, it's actually dangerous. And that's why I know it's so scary for a 14-year-old kid today who's asking the kind of questions I asked when I was 14 and when you asked when you were 14. But it's important, I think.
Yeah. And what I find interesting, and I don't know, maybe I would understand it if I was on the other side of the issues, but the idea that when you bring up that there's a white supremacist history to the Christian tradition we inherited, sometimes that gets met with a lot of anger and resistance, because I think people can't separate them, like saying we received this and now we get to decide what to do about it, as opposed to I'm calling you a specific person a white supremacist, right?
Exactly right. And in fact, we probably have to find gentler ways of saying it to people, but the fact that people react so strongly says a bunch of things. One of the things it says is they're terribly afraid to have any critique of their tradition. Because if they depart from their tradition, they will be departing from God and they will be going to hell. Yep. And oh my gosh, what a mess. That whole, what that says about God, what that says about Jesus, and what that says about the kind of communities that we grew up in. And here's the irony. Josh, this is a terrible metaphor I'm about to use, okay? But everybody I tell this to says, yeah, that's interesting, but you shouldn't, expect this to do anything but cause trouble. But the metaphor I like to use is being born into the mafia. You get born into the mafia, and you're an Italian kid with a loving Italian family. Everybody's close. You're close to aunts and uncles, your grandparents. Everybody's close. In fact, the fact that they're in the mafia might mean they're a closer family than they'd be otherwise, because everybody's got to keep each other's secrets. And all you know of being in this family is that it's a close, wonderful family. It's all you've ever known. And then you turn 14 or 15 and some little corner is torn off and you see, what's going on here? And you start to learn the family secrets and you're faced with a heart-wrenching choice. And I think that's a lot of what it's like to grow up fundamentalist, because all you experience in one level is a close-knit community who sings songs and loves each other. But then you find out, hold it, our community was on the wrong side of the civil rights movement. Hold it, our community was on the wrong side of slavery. Hold it, our movement was on the wrong side of what happened to the Native peoples. Hold it, our community is on the wrong side of how women should be treated. Hold it, it just keeps going on. Our community is on the wrong side of science. Our community is on the wrong side of caring for the environment. Our community is on the wrong side of caring for the poor. But we're going to heaven, and that one thing compensates for everything else. Anyway, it's kind of scary.
Yeah, just that whole narrative is built around getting out of this world and into something else. So much so that you're willing to let this world, it really doesn't matter what happens, and injustice is just accepted.
Yeah.
Because it'll be better later.
And what's so interesting for me, because I love the Bible, Josh, I have, my love for the Bible is deeper now than it's ever been. But I grew up, we called our churches Bible churches sometimes, and we had Bible camp, and we had Bible groups and Bible studies, and everything was Bible. And I memorized huge passages of the Bible. I know the Bible really, really quite well. I jokingly say I've forgotten more of the Bible than most people, ever learn. But I still know a lot. And but we were taught a certain way of reading the Bible. Can I give you a quick example?
Please.
So one of the verses I memorized was from Isaiah. Come, let us reason together, saith the Lord. I learned it in King James, so it was saith the Lord. Though your sins be as scarlet, they will, though your sins be as scarlet, they will be as white as snow. Though they are as crimson, they will be as wool. I memorized that verse, and I heard that verse quoted an awful lot. One day, I don't know, I might have been 14 or 15 years old. I made the mistake of reading the verses that come before it and the verses that come after it. And you realize that whole passage, for us, that was important because we used it as a metaphor for regeneration, for an ontological change in the heart, justification by grace through faith. And that verse suggested that penal substitutionary atonement came in, that our hearts were changed from bloody red to wool white, right? But what you read before and after that is, I'm sick of your gatherings. I'm sick of your worship meetings. I'm sick of all of your sacrifices because you don't care for the widow and you don't care for the orphan and you don't care for the oppressed. I'm sick of all your religiosity. All I really care about is justice for the oppressed. Man, I didn't know what to do with that, right? And then you start to realize, oh gosh, the book of Romans, you must have learned the Romans road, right?
Oh my goodness. We had the bracelets with the beads,
yeah,
the different color beads.
That came out after me, but I know about that. And so we knew you memorize, Romans 1:8 and Romans 3:23 and Romans 6, and we knew, but I remember I'd been a pastor for many years, and I read a book by N.T. Wright called What St. Paul Really Said, I think was the title. And it disturbed me so much because I could tell when he read the book of Romans, he saw something different than I did. So I literally, this is in the days of computers already, I went to my computer and I downloaded the book of Romans, created a document, and I started going through and writing my own commentary where I was trying to not read the Romans road, but actually grapple with what is in the text. And all I can say is, now I realize that the Romans road was a clever trick to make us not see what was really there in the book of Romans, And sometimes it's not, there are other subtleties involved. Like every time I would read the word saved or salvation, I had a preconceived definition of what that meant. The definition that didn't come from the Bible, it came from, I didn't know this. I didn't know it had a history. He came from St. Augustine and